Good morning, class. How is everybody doing today? Y'all, yeah, that's right. We have reached the conclusion of false spring. We are back to winter for another day or two, and then it'll be an oven. So I would say wear your scarf, wear your coat, wear your hat and gloves as long as you can. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Out of the freezer into the steamer. So we are like 14 chapters into Revelation now, which is pretty incredible. We will see probably in the things that we studied today a somewhat of a repetition of events, and it's presented as if it's happening for the first time, but then you'll read it and go, yeah, but didn't that already? And yes, and that's okay. Let's start with a bit of an overview. So, Revelation is a book of prophetic vision. Prophetic vision, you should expect things will have a high degree, almost exclusively, everything is symbolic, right? Everything has a representational element to it. So, the fire might not be fire, and the lamb might not just be an animal, right? And the sea might not just be salty water, right? Everything is symbolic for the most part. And I keep saying for the most part because, you can't just say like, well, what is the symbolic meaning of the word "and" here? Okay, well, that's not the way symbolism works, but, numbers are symbolic. Events are symbolic in many ways. The book of Revelation was given to the Apostle John on the Isle of Patmos, and there Jesus comes to him and introduces himself through his presentation, right? He has a golden sash, he's got white hair and clothes, he's got these lampstands that he walks amongst and stars in his hand. And all that's to cue you into not only what his driver's license would say, like who he is in that sort of sense, but who he is in a deeper sense, right? He's revealing truths about himself, deep truths. When he speaks, out of his mouth comes a double-edged sword, right? He dictates 7 letters, each to one of the 7 churches in Asia Minor, each wrapped up with, "He who has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." Each of those letters referenced the vision that came before, either the words spoken or the actual images that appeared. All of this cluing us in to say, yeah, just because he's talking to the church in, Smyrna, doesn't mean he's not also talking to you. Also, not everything he's saying to that church is going to apply as directly to you as it does to them right now. There's 7 different churches going through 7 different things. Your church will not be like all of them at the same time, right? And yet, every bit of it is worth learning, lest errors that you haven't fallen into become the errors that you fall into tomorrow. Moreover, so he has that. After those letters are dictated, John is brought up to heaven, and now he sees things from top down. Much of our experience of God is sort of ground up, He comes and reveals himself to us in our context. But what happens to John, and this sort of thing does happen occasionally throughout Scripture as well. Ezekiel has some experiences like this, for example. I saw the Lord seated on the throne, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, right? The train of his robe filled the temple. So he's seeing a throne room vision of God. John is given the not just a perspective of God in heaven, but actually he gets to look down on history from that heavenly perspective. And kind of by necessity, it is difficult for him to understand all that's going on. He doesn't usually have that top-down perspective, and his capacity isn't more than a mortal man. So much of what goes on during this revelation, John doesn't understand. And I'm not saying that as a judgment of him. I'm saying that as that's how he talks, right? The 144,000 people with whitewashed robes appear, and an elder approaches John and says, "Who are these?" And John goes, maybe you could tell me who they are, right? There's a scroll sealed with 7 seals. And the question goes out, who will be found worthy to open the 7 seals? And nobody speaks up, and John gets depressed about it. He's crestfallen. He knows it's important. And then the elder sidles up to him and says, "It's okay. The Lamb's going to come do it." Right? It's like the elder knows, but John doesn't. So, John his role in this is not to understand it necessarily. I think he has the same opportunity we do to sit with the vision, digest it, look at our current circumstances and apply it. But in the moment it's happening, his job really isn't to understand it. His job is to witness it and then to bear witness to what he saw, right? So write this down. Okay, I'll do that. Understanding will come later. The way Paul talks about the limitations of this mortal life that we now live, he says, now we understand in part. When we're with Christ in eternity, then we will know fully. Now we see us through a glass darkly. Then we will see with unveiled eyes, right? So that's John's experience right now. He is the conduit by which this immensely dense, powerful, true, spiritual, in many ways alien to him way of seeing history is just being poured. And so he's just going to try and faithfully record it. And by the Holy Spirit, he does so. And then he can chew on it for the rest of his life. 2,000 years later, we're still chewing on it. And that's good. All that to say, so the message of Revelation, as with the whole Bible, bless you, is just more obvious with Revelation. It transcends the capacity of the guy who penned it. Somebody asked me this question about David last week. They said, when David was writing the 22nd Psalm, I'm paraphrasing the question, but this is the gist of it. When David was writing the 22nd Psalm, did he know he was talking about what would happen to the Messiah? My God, why have you forsaken me? That thing that we read every, do we do that? I think we do that on Maundy Thursday. Did he know, point for point, he was talking about the Messiah? My understanding of Psalm 22 is probably not. He probably was speaking from his own experience, trying to describe what he's going through. But what happened is, by the power of the Holy Spirit, God put into his mouth words that had a greater significance than his personal struggle. Right? So, was David prophesying? Yes. Was he aware he was prophesying? Maybe not. A lot of prophets are, but, maybe he wasn't in that moment. That's okay. But all scripture is like that. When Luke sits down to pen a gospel, I think he's just trying to faithfully represent what happened. But I believe by faith, and I think also just 2,000 years of reading it has borne out that, yeah, but when he wrote it down, he did something beyond what a mortal can do. There's transcendent truth here and probably details included there that had a significance far beyond what he knew when he wrote it. I'm rambling. Should I get back on task? Okay. Y'all are too nice to tell me so. So John's taken up to heaven. He's given us a heavenly perspective. The book begins in heaven with all of the living creatures and the elders and everybody. What are they doing up there? Are they engaging in brutal warfare? Are they mourning and weeping? They're worshiping. The beginning of the book, all those in heaven are worshiping the Lamb on the throne. It starts with worship. Big spoilers. If you haven't read this 2,000-year-old book yet, your window for spoilers is it's over. Big spoilers. They'll also be worshiping in the end. And that sort of cycle, I think, is helpful for us to... you can apply it to your life right now. Right? You come here on Sunday, hopefully you have a mountaintop experience. Hopefully you have a Mount of Transfiguration kind of thing, right? I alluded to this in my sermon last week. When we come to worship, we come expecting to meet with Jesus, for his glory to be revealed amongst us, for us to hear the truth of God, Moses and Elijah, the law and prophets, and then Christ himself, the literal embodiment of the gospel, right? You expect to have that experience on a Sunday morning, and it's good. And then you descend the mountain, you go out into the world, and it's a mess out there. Maybe it's a mess in your own home, right? Well, that's okay. You struggle through it, and then Sunday rolls around again. And we move, from praise to praise and from victory to victory. We do so through hardships and difficulties. So the middle of the book of Revelation is what most people think about, and in particular, if you polled, 50 Christians, polled randomly from different congregations, and you said, when you think of Revelation, what do you think about? What kind of answers do you think you'd get? End times, Armageddon, yeah. The tribulation, They always think about the scary stuff and the hard stuff, and no question, there's a lot of that quantitatively in the book. After all, we've seen the world end twice now already, probably. And I got another one coming up for you this week, probably, if we get that far. So yeah, that makes a certain kind of sense, but the message of Revelation, and I hope you carry this with you. If you get very little else from this class, I hope you get this. The message of Revelation is not brace yourself for the hard times. The message of Revelation is the hard times don't mean God is that things are out of control. And God has victory for you at the end. That's the message of Revelation. It's not meant to scare you. It's meant to give you hope and endurance and peace through the hard times. So, I don't know. We review every week, but then I know there are people who are tuning in for the first time potentially every week. So, some of us are knuckleheads and we need it. Let's just keep it to... I'll skip out on a lot of events. We'll just keep it to the most recent sort of segment of the book. We had the scroll with the 7 seals. We had the 7 trumpets. After all that, there was a hinge to a different narrative. It started with a glorious and radiant woman crowned with stars. She was pregnant, seated on the moon. And a dragon. And the dragon wanted to devour her child. But the woman was given wings and flown off into the wilderness, and there she escaped the dragon. The baby was born, and he was carried up to heaven where the dragon couldn't reach him. But the dragon is still full of rage and vitriol, and he's cast down from heaven, and he's stuck on earth. And in one of the very rare times in the book, we're given a one-to-one identification as to who the dragon is. Who is the dragon? Satan, right? Besides the obvious thematic connections, I think part of the reason that we so confidently identify the snake in the garden with Satan is because of this. God says that dragon is Satan. That dragon, the winged serpent, right, is thrown to the earth and bound to it. And God says to the snake in the garden, "Cursed are you above all creatures. You will crawl on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life." As opposed to what? It seems like before that pronouncement, the snake wasn't stuck on the ground, So, the dragon, he doesn't do all the work himself. He calls forth from the sea a great beast, 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. It has a similarity in form, but a different skin to the dragon, right? Dragon has 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. But the dragon, scaly, reptilian, whatever. The beast from the sea is mammalian. So leopard, bear parts, and lion parts. But, I think if you squint, the silhouette wouldn't be terribly different, right? So that beast called from the sea, and the sea, I'll remind you, probably stands for something like change, tumult, chaos, right? The sea is notoriously out of control, right? So out of the chaos of earth, the dragon calls forth this beast, and that beast claims the authority of the dragon and demands the worship of the dragon. He seems to, the worship of on behalf of the dragon, he seems to represent, for reasons that we've already covered, something like earthly political power, like the secular power of men. It wouldn't have to be political necessarily, but that's usually our first idea of how it manifests. You think of a king, he exercises power over his fellow men. He does so by imposing order over chaos. Right? That's what most kings did, or chiefs, right? If they're going to have a kingdom rise, it's because they give safety and protection to people who didn't have that previously. They organize disorganized people underneath them. So they take this chaos and they make order from it. And that order, usually when imposed by humans, tends toward tyranny eventually. Right? So you can think about the first beast as being sort of that. Out of the chaos, he comes, flexes his muscle, and people flock to him. And then a second beast is summoned by the dragon. This beast doesn't come out of the sea, it comes out of the land, right? And you could think about this progressively, right? So in the sea, the beast imposes his order. Out of that ordered state, out of civilization, out of that stability, comes the second beast. And the second beast is less of a secular political figure, more of a religious figure, right? He is one encouraging a kind of worship. He sets up an image of the first beast. He animates it, right? And he directs the people in worship. You can see these sort of things happen throughout history. And unfortunately, it happens in all kinds of religions, but the one that we actually care about right now is, in fact, Christianity. And this is what happens when Christianity abandons the gospel of Jesus Christ for any other gospel, and it happens all the time. So if you have a gospel of prosperity, then your Christ will be whomever helps deliver that to people, right? So if you worship at the altar of comfort and security and prosperity, well, then of course you're going to point people toward your political leaders, the people making economic and military decisions, right? If the gospel you preach is a gospel of advancement and human progress, well, then maybe you might direct people more in the worship of science and thought leaders and all that sort of thing, right? And depending on what church you go into today, they might have a cross or not. They might say Christian on the label or not, but if the message being preached there is more to do with how human leaders, whether they're political or thought leaders or whatever, how they are the solution to your problems, then you're not really at a Christian church, right? The Christian church is one that preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ. All right, so we've got these two beasts. And they gain control over secular society, and especially over economics, right? They require that to do business, you have to have a mark on your forehead or your hand. Without that, you can't do business. Now, I do think it's fascinating that in a more, I want to be careful about how I say this, in a less urbanized way of living, you don't actually have to do business to survive, right? If you've got your own little plot of land that you're farming and you've got your own grove of trees and you've got your own flocks, whatever, you actually don't have to engage in business to survive. Most of us aren't in that state right now. Some of y'all might be close, though. I know some of y'all got some animals and you got some chickens and maybe some goats, and you could be kind of self-sufficient. I am not saying that what's demanded of Christians is that they live off the grid. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. But if you watch this progression from chaos into order and civilization into stability, and then the dependence that comes upon that, not being able to do business for most people in our modern, let's just talk about Americans because that's my touch point. Most modern Americans, if you can't do business, you can't eat. You won't have a home. You won't have clothes, right? I think it's fascinating. As a corollary to this, as a preacher who sometimes needs to preach parables or psalms, I have to do extra work because I can't assume everybody in here has ever grown anything or herded anything, right? When I preach the parable of the sower, we have to talk about why it's weird that he would just throw the seeds everywhere. You might not catch that if you've never had to purchase seeds, right? As an example. So, I don't know, make of that what you will. The beasts demand this mark, and the mark of the beast is what? Yeah, 666. A symbolic number, right? As we expect from numbers in this book, it has symbolic value. If 7 is a number that denotes holiness, which is to say, being set aside for God, being dedicated to God, what might 6 represent? Falling short. That's right. I think I told you before, the Greek word that is translated as sin in our Bible has a more literal meaning of to miss the mark. To miss the mark. 6 definitely misses the mark of 7. But not only does it do so in a repentant way, but it does so in a flagrant way. Not once, not twice, but thrice, right? When you see a number repeated 3 times in a row, usually it's a emphatic thing, right? It's an emphasis. We're making a strong statement here. So that strong statement of the beast is, you identify as your sin. Now, there are 144,000 arrayed in white, and they never received that mark. Why didn't they? Well, because their names were written in the book of life. Because they had already been sealed. There was already a mark on their forehead. To whose credit is that? Well, it's to God's credit. He marked them. He wrote their name in the book. It's by his grace that they don't fall into the same trap as the world. And that's important to remember, because sometimes we get it wrong and we think that the blessings of God goes to those who have the fortitude or the wisdom or whatever to avoid the traps, when a better understanding is, well, if you have fortitude and wisdom, it's because those are gifts from God. But ultimately, if you have avoided the snares and traps of the devil, that's a mercy that God showed you, and you should just be thankful for that and compassionate to those who are struggling. All right. We got to the 3 angels flying in midair. The first proclaiming, we did, because we got all the way to verse 14, according to my notes. So I'll just, in brief, we have these 3 angels making this profession. Jonathan, will you pull my mic down just like 2 little ticks? I hear a little whistle, and I don't want to. Thanks. So the first angel is proclaiming the gospel to every nation, and along with that gospel is a call to repent. The second, the cry is, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. The third gives that warning that those who follow the way of the beast are doomed for destruction. When we as Lutherans use the word gospel, we tend to use it in a very specific way. Good news, the good news of Jesus Christ. Some of your other Protestant friends might use the word gospel in a much more broad way. Not like Broadway, but like, in a more generalized way, where it's, just any word of God, and that would have a mixture of both the comforts of God's salvation as well as conviction about sin. I remember when I was in Virginia, I pulled into a parking lot once because I had missed my turn. I was just turning around, and I figured churches generally are safe places to turn around. If I pull into a church and somebody wants to hassle me about it, I'll be like, well, I guess I'm never visiting here, So the name of the church was the Evangelical Full Gospel Church. If you know, the word evangelical means of the gospel. So it was the gospel of Full Gospel Church. Okay. And I because I'm a little bit judgmental, I happened to notice that there were reserved parking signs, for like handicapped people and whatever. But the one closest to the front door was for the pastor. And I'm thinking, well, first off, any parking sign is law. Like, that's not gospel. And secondly, come on, dude. But see, that's me. That's me being judgmental. And I probably shouldn't do that. But you can imagine in a church like that, probably they don't mean that it is only good news and no law. They just use the word differently than we. So here in Revelation, it seems like it might be that more broad way of speaking, when it says, he's proclaiming the gospel, and then it's like, yeah, Jesus, but also destruction's coming, like, okay. The good news there might be a little bit more implicit, right? And there is a bit of good news, I suppose, because early in the book, you remember the altar of incense, there were the 5,000 martyrs underneath it, the souls of them, and they cried out, "How long, Lord, must we wait for your vengeance to come," right? How long until, I'm kind of rephrasing this in a way that has a more positive valence. How long until you put an end to evil and evildoers, right? Well, those three angels are saying the answer to that question, not long. It's coming right now. So that'll bring us up to verse 14, and we can finally start in on something new. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man with a crown of gold in his head. So far, so good. And a sharp sickle in his hand. In our popular cultural conception, if you talk about some spirit or spiritual being who carries a sharp sickle, what pops to mind? Yeah. What's the term you use for him? The Grim Reaper. How was he dressed? Black robe, skeletal hands, maybe no face at all. Part of me thinks, is this where that image comes from? But this doesn't track. This is one like a son of man wearing a crown of gold, sitting on a white cloud. Oh, by the way, when we read one like a son of man, what does that phrase mean to you? Does that refer to anybody in general? The figure in Daniel, yeah. What were you going to say? Yeah, that's the label that Jesus used most frequently to talk about himself, right? So maybe this is Jesus. Now let's not forget Jesus is also the Lamb sitting on the throne. He's also the guy in the white with the long beard that walking between the lampstands. He's all over the place. That's okay. It's okay for multiple images to represent the same thing. Okay, so he's got a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Jesus tells a story not unlike this, a parable. The parable of the wheat and the tares. Y'all know this parable? Man owned a field, and in that field was sown all kinds of good wheat. But in the night, an enemy came in and sowed into his field tares, weeds, right? Meant to choke the crop. And the worker in the vineyard said, "Lord, there are these weeds in your field. Do you want us to go pull them?" And the master said, "No. If you do, you may also pull up the good wheat with it. Instead, I need you to wait until the harvest, and then we'll sort them out at the harvest." So in that picture, what is the field? Earth. I think we can narrow it a little bit. Liberty Hill. I think we can narrow it even farther and broaden it at the same time. So where would you find God's good harvest that he desires? In the church. And yet also ostensibly in the church, you get people who are not of God, right? People whose faith maybe is not genuine. And in that you might have a mixture of people who are malicious, or maybe people who don't have malicious intent, they simply don't belong to God, right? It's a mixture. Now, as pastor, I know my job is to differentiate who is who and get rid of those who are not genuine, right? No. Because what might happen? Well, when I kick so-and-so out, who maybe doesn't belong here, the person next to them might go with them, and they do belong here. Rather, God says, leave them until the harvest, right? Which is a great relief to me. I don't have to sort out who's genuine and who's not. Now, if there's nonsense going on that's disruptive or hurtful, we can address the behavior. But as far as me as the guy tending this garden is concerned, I can treat everybody like they are God's people. And that's what I'm going to do, because I don't know any different. So after the harvest, there's a sorting of the wheat and the tares. The tares go to the fire, the wheat get gathered into the barn, right? Hopefully you know the parable, and if you didn't, now you've heard it in brief. The tares are not mentioned in this account. They're not mentioned in this vision. So, but I think the reference is direct enough that, it's helpful to think like that. So perhaps this harvest of the earth is the church. Another angel came out of the temple, and he too had a sharp sickle. So this is not that first one with the crown, who's like a son of man. It's a different angel. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." Now, usually in the symbols, in the metaphoric language of the Bible, like in parables, for example, grapes are usually positive, right? The vine dresser goes out and he prunes the vines so that they might yield more grapes, all that kind of thing. They're positive. I'm just telling you, we'll get there in a verse or two. In this case, it's not positive. It's actually quite a negative thing. And I was wondering, why? Why, if it usually has a positive meaning to it, why would he choose grapes to I'm sorry, let me give you my interpretation here. If the wheat represents the church, then the grapes would be the harvest of the earth that isn't the church. So this would be the rest of the unbelieving world. And its fruits may be pleasing to the eye and may be desirable for food, right? Is anybody in here kind of a wine nerd? Anybody who knows a lot about wine? Okay, good. Got a couple hands in the back. For all the rest of y'all, I'm going to look like I know things. Yeah. You got to swirl it, you got to sniff it, There's an idea in winemaking that where the grapes grow is really important, okay? Because, and this is true in coffee too, but he's not talking about coffee, so I guess coffee is safe. But it's also true in chocolate. But in wine in particular is where this term comes up. This idea that the soil that the vine is planted in makes a huge difference. The climate surrounding it makes a huge difference, such that the same variety of grape grown in two different places and then put through the same exact winemaking process after the harvest, they will taste very different. Most of the names you have for the various kinds of wines are representative of where they grow, not of necessarily the variety of the grape. There's a term for the taste of the land that you get in the grapes. It's called terroir. Everybody Terroir. Come on. Terroir. There you go. It's French. It might be true of wheat. I don't know if it is. It's probably true to some extent, but I can't imagine that it's true to the same extent, which means that your wheat tastes like what was sown. The grapes taste like where it's grown, right? So, I don't know. Maybe I'm making too much out of this. But I like the idea that the church is less impacted in its essence by the world than the grape would be. Again, maybe I'm putting too much on this. I don't want to hang on that too much. But I think we're safe enough to say the wheat represents the church, the grapes represent the unchurch. So he goes and he gathers the grapes, and the angel swung his sickle on the earth, verse 19, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. This is where the term the grapes of wrath comes from, by the way. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 16,000 stadia. This is an aspect of God that I do not like to think about. That there is a time for destruction. It hurts my heart to think about God in that way. I want to get at least to the next verse before we finish today.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Well, when I never really caught on to this, but when he talks about fruit of the vine, this sort of flies in the face of the idea of fruit of the vine is grace and humility and patience and kindness.
Yeah, well, that'd be the fruits of the Spirit.
Or I'm sorry, fruits of the Spirit. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So not all fruit is.
Yeah, and that's why, the symbols of the Bible don't always mean the same thing forever and forever, right? So like yeast is often a symbol for sin, but it's not always. So in this case, grapes are a good metaphor for positive things in many places. In this particular place, he's just using the same symbol to represent a different idea. And so you got to be careful, because it would be easy enough to say, well, it's a grape. Here's what this is what it says about grapes. Here's what it says about grapes. And that's why I was trying to be careful taking that parable about the wheat and saying, oh, it's this. But putting it in the context of the entire vision, it still seems to square. So, but here's probably why the grape was chosen. You remember previously we talked about Babylon the Great, and she was making people drunk with the wine of her adulteries and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, where does wine come from? It comes from grapes, right? So I think it's more an identification with that sort of thing, with the wine of sinfulness. And again, we have the Baptist beat on this. We know that wine itself, literal wine, is not a sinful substance, right? But drunkenness is, right? Drunkenness is sinful. And so it's a self-feeding problem. It's a self-devouring problem, which is how sin works, right? The people get drunk on the wine of their wickedness, but where does that wine come from? Their own sinful humanity, right? So evil always ultimately devours itself. Evil always reduces in the end. So, I don't like this idea of God's wrath, and I don't like this idea of judgment, and I don't like this idea that people would be pressed and that blood would come. Hurts my heart. It's terrible, right? I want to keep reading, though. I want to go into Revelation 15. And as a reminder to you, none of these books had chapter numbers or verse numbers when they were written. That's added later on to help us find verses. When it was written, it was just a story, okay? So don't take those chapter breaks as being super significant. Yeah? So right on the heels of what we just read, listen to this. I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign. 7 angels with 7 plagues. With the 7 last plagues. Matters. Last because with them God's wrath is completed. I don't know if we're going to go into the 7 bowls today. Actually, I know we won't, but I want to talk about this real quick. God's wrath is completed. God's wrath is completed. Well, when is God's love completed? So he doesn't love anymore? Right. Yeah. So God's wrath is completed. So on the one hand, when you say something's completed, you can say, it has run its course. It has done all that it was required to do, right? When I turn on the dishwasher, when its work is completed, I have clean dishes. I don't need it to keep running. It did its job and now it's done, right? Until 5 minutes later when I've got another sink full of dirty dishes, right? Nevertheless, right? So you could start with this idea that so maybe the wrath of God has a purpose, but also it's not an enduring purpose. His wrath will be completed, and then we can rejoice that his wrath is completed. It doesn't persist, because the wrath of God is not an essential part of who he is. The love of God is essential to who he is. The mercy, compassion, creativity, the generosity of God, those never cease. But the wrath of God will come to an end. Because it's not who he is. It's just a necessary part of the unfolding story. And then one day he will put the wrath away and never get it out again. I just wanted to dwell on that, right? Because I do think that's a really important thing for us to understand. As we read about God's wrath being poured out, he doesn't revel or indulge in that. I think he is as grieved by the application of his wrath as we are. Probably more so. Because who does God not love? Exactly. So I think we'll wrap there. We'll just start up Revelation 15 fresh next time we get together. But I wanted to end on that idea that while God's wrath is a terrifying thing, it's also important to understand that it's not who he is. And there's a day in which the wrath comes to an end, but there is never a day when his love and mercy come to an end. All right, great. We'll stick around. We got church coming up in 10 minutes. Thank you for being here, and yeah.